hosting Alan Muscat today. He is the founder of the wild food foraging tour company No Taste Like Home, and has been described as a philosophorager. And the model, the No Taste Like Home model, foraging in the field and heading straight to a restaurant, is something he pioneered, and it's something that we would love to bring to Balsam one day. So I will pass it over to him without much further ado. Looks like we've got more folks signing in, so I am going to mute myself and hand it over to Alan.
Oh, great. Can you hear me? I'm on. Okay. Well, beautiful. I thank you for having me. And it's just unusual circumstances. I call myself an outsider for various reasons, but we're inside today, and I hope it inspires everyone to join me on a walk on the preserve as soon as we can schedule that, so you can actually experience what we'll talk about tonight. Well, there's another thing about being a forager, which is half of what I do, gather wild food, and I talk about it and teach. And I'd like to not use a canned speech any more than I like canned food. The thing about wild food is you never know what you're going to find, and you just head out and you trust in it. So rather than deliver something, what do we call a TV dinner of a talk, I'm open to your questions, and I do have, some material I'll share. But the first thing I'm going to do is go up to the chat, and I'm going to put in a bunch of possible questions that you might have to sort of whet your appetite. So if you know how to do that, it's on the top right, and it's a little like talking bubble, and that'll pull up the window. And these are questions I get asked all the time, and I'm happy to answer any of them. And so if you know what you want to ask, great. And if you don't have an idea, maybe this will give you one, and you can cut and paste it, or you can type in your own question on the side. And one of us will see it. I guess I'll try to keep that up myself. But let me tell you, if you have no idea who I am and why you're here, past what Jen said, I live in Asheville, and here, when I came here 25 years ago, I started gathering wild food for restaurants, particularly mushrooms, and that was several 100 pounds a year. And I decided to start teaching, and gradually transitioned to where I only taught. And then 5-10 years ago, I started hiring other people to help me teach. And now we have 5 guides, and we're basically a tour company because most of our clientele are tourists, and that supports our work in schools and with families and other populations that can't necessarily afford those prices. So everything we do is pay what you can. And the latest thing that we're doing for folks since COVID is going to their yards and labeling what's edible. And actually Jen's house was my first experiment in that, in doing it. And now we are past the beta stage, and that's something you can do wherever you live, but we design that for locals in particular to help them get started with wild foods. Gosh, there's so much more I could say on that, but seeing as no one has questions yet, what I'm going to attempt to do is to switch you over to some pictures. So hopefully you can now see an example of one of our tour groups. And this is actually in June of a few years ago. So these are some of the things that you would find now. And as you could see, we have people of all ages, and we take them out to eat. so to speak. And like Jen said, they can go to a restaurant afterwards with the food we found, and they'll prepare a dish for them, or they can take it home and have the, make their own meal with it. Um, so, yeah. Here's a little quote from, I think it's from Japan, and some of you might be familiar with fugu. It's a fish that if you don't prepare it right, it kills you. And the same is true of this mushroom, which is sometimes called the false morel. And what people say about it is the same thing, that like, the way I put it is, if you eat wild foods, you may get sick, but if you don't eat wild foods, I guarantee you'll get sick. And to me, what that means is like it's healthier to eat wild foods, and the risk is, for me, far greater of not eating them than of eating them. And that's one of the reasons I eat them. And this slideshow, if I go through it, goes through 7 reasons that I have found that people, not just I believe in eating wild foods, but when I ask people why they're doing it, it's always one of those reasons. And I don't think people are eating fugu for health-wise, but it's for pleasure, and that's another one of the 7 reasons. So, I'll run through those until somebody flashes a question, and I'll jump to answer it.
I have a quick question for you, Alan.
Yes.
I'd love to know what was your journey to becoming a forager? What piqued your interest? How did you get started? Did you grow up doing it, or did your studies lead you to it?
Yeah. Well, let's see. Like I said, this is going to be a sort of a unplugged lecture, and if I can, there we go. I'm going to skip to the part that answers that question, because that's part of this talk, and I don't mind you seeing that. How did is that right? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, everyone wants to know that. It's really interesting question, or interesting point that people want to put it in context, and I guess it bridges my reality from everyone else's. But I don't think it's that different. I mean, I grew up in Miami. Let's see. I said I was an outsider. Can you guess which one is me? And my whole family was, because they're from Cuba, and before that they're from Jewish, and so we've gone through a bunch of sort of exiles. That's how they got to Cuba, and that's why they left Cuba, and ended up in Miami, where I grew up. And the part they don't like me saying is that we like to get something for nothing, which means that I joke that I used to go to yard sales with them, and now I go to a yard sale every day in my yard, and everything's free. So back then I wasn't foraging, but I did have an appreciation for opportunity. So I might have called it like opportunivorism, at this point. Let's see what else is on this slideshow. I actually received an award from McDonald's. So at that point, I was not eating wild food or even healthy food. And I was playing into the system. But eventually, I ended up at Princeton for doing that. And this article came out years later. And in the interim, I had ended up ditching everything. I mean, I did barely finish my degree. And this is when I arrived in Asheville. I lived with 3 witches, basically. That's what they would call themselves. They were herbalists. And that's dandelion drying in the sun in front of them. And this is our backyard in Madison County on a farm where we paid $300 between us a month for 45 acres and a farmhouse. And that's what drew me, which is partly it was being affordable. And I got into foraging because I didn't want a job. I wanted to get out of the system. I was sort of back to the land, hippie. I had studied Taoism in college and philosophy, which is why I call myself philosophorager. But the philosophy that I took to besides Taoism, was also early Marxism, and both of them were about the fact that we're not living natural lives now, so we're not satisfied. But if we did, we'd be happy. And so I decided to pursue that. And I also had learned, I didn't want to be part of a system that was exploiting, humans and nature, or be part of the rat race anymore that I had been in. So, independence was one of the reasons. So now that's 3 reasons I've told you to eat wild food, right? Do you remember? Healthier, more enjoyable, pleasurable for a number of reasons. I call that the foodie reason. There's variety, it's fresher. And then a sense of independence. But I guess I may have hinted at the 4th, which is like better for the planet as well. So I don't know how many of those were actually conscious for me at the time, but that's how I got into it. And so in some sense it came from childhood in, realizing like, hey, there's free stuff out there. Why aren't people taking advantage of it? And then in college I came to a new, what would I call it, octave of that, which is like, hey, we've lost touch with what keeps us and the planet healthy. And it's free. And it's basically a Garden of Eden that is all around us. And even that way of saying it, I was not conscious of for another 20 years. Until I heard somebody say that phrase, this Garden of Eden phrase, it didn't click for me that is what has pulled me to this. I love talking about that piece of it. But that's the real, the meaning, I think, that threads through it. Yeah. What else? That's us chopping wood. It's me skinning a rabbit. My grumpy housemate at the time. This is our bathroom. I woke up one morning and fell through that hole. My leg went through it, and I was delighted because mushrooms, as you can see highlighted in the photo, had rotted out the floor. So there's actually a haiku in Japanese that says, what was it? I was happy falling off the horse with finding mushrooms, something like that. And that was my experience there. All right, so here I get into why forage, and I had already started that. But let me bounce back, or can you tell me, Jen, has anyone asked any questions yet? Not yet? Okay. Well.
No, I think if we just get through perhaps you said the sort of the 7 reasons, that might maybe answer some questions for folks that they have not yet vocalized.
Yeah, great. So, all right, so this is an ironic title for where most of us get our food, at the store. And there's a reason it's called the store, because things are stored there. And remember, I started off talking about, eating fresher and having a talk that wasn't canned like the food. But is it safe to do that? That's the first of 4 myths that people have continually when confronted with the idea of foraging. The first was, it's too dangerous. So I'm not sure if I don't recall, I can't look ahead with this, but the way I'm running this technology. But to me, again, if you eat wild foods, you may get sick. If this is what you eat instead, I guarantee you will get sick. You see? So it may be cheaper in the short run, but when you figure out the healthcare bills in the long run, it might not be. I was visiting actually family, and we went shopping, and I had to take a shot of this picture, and this is the so-called real deal, and you could see. I wonder if my pointer showing up? Maybe. It is, right. Save 0 per pound. You see that? All right. Well, years later, I took out a family, and you can see the quote here. This was a true quote that one of the kids said about one of the reasons to forage. I think she's a little unclear on the concept. But So the first was healthier, I'm pretty sure, right? This is number two. That's liberating, and I might have called it independence before. And that mushroom's actually edible, at least when it's young, and that one probably only the edges are edible at this point. But it's not just mushrooms, even though that was my specialty. I sort of expanded to plants, and this is stinging nettle. And some of us might hate stinging nettle because they've gotten stung. But, that is like, I don't know, you driving your car and you crash into someone and they yell at you and you think that they're jerks because they're so mad at you. Well, who ran into who, right? It's the same with poison ivy. I could talk about it. It has a great function in the ecosystem. Now, this nettles is, doing wonders for this hillside, and it would for you. As soon as you cook it, it doesn't sting. So stinging nettle is a poster child for wild foods, because like a lot of people, who might rub you the wrong way or have a rough exterior, when you get to know them, you realize they're really wonderful people. And stinging nettle is a great example of that. This crazy looking mushroom looks like a brain, is actually called cauliflower, but it smells, and it's more like pasta once you cook it up, and it's edible too. The reason now I remember why I put this photo in is that this guy lives in Asheville, and he is a full-time forager. This is how he makes his living. And he came here on my recommendation, calling me from Missouri, and I said, sure, yeah, I think you'll do well here. And he has, yeah. All right, third reason. This is my girlfriend's niece. That was her toy. We didn't open it for her, don't worry. But she has since learned quite a few wild foods. In fact, I experimented with that What's in My Yard service at her house. That was the second one that I did. And this book that's shown here, if you want to research the sort of nuts and bolts of all the vitamins and minerals in wild food, you can get some of that from this book. My summary is that wild foods are 5 to 50 times more nutritious than what you would get in the store, generally speaking. And the funny thing with having a beer in this picture is that there was a big proponent of wild foods up until he passed a few years ago. He was a botanist for the USDA, and he would always say, the toxins that we point to in wild foods, in certain ones in particular, like sassafras, there's more of them in a 6-pack of beer than you could get in a truckload of sassafras. So we're blind to the junk food that we normally eat. That's actually me in one of the photos. This is Grove, as in Grove Park Inn, and he made his fortune in medicine, but wild food is medicine, and it's preventative medicine, as is illustrated here by the forest doctor. People ask me, well, what is nettles good for? What's in it? And I don't think about things that way. I don't feel like I have to. Again, people in the true Garden of Eden, which is everything before agriculture, everyone didn't have to look and analyze things and read labels. We ate what we were adapted to eat, and that's why it was good for us. It was that simple. And this is what we're adapted for. This is a picture from a National Geographic shoot that was done. That's my living room table. It's actually behind me. If I turn I could point backwards. If I put myself back on, you'll see that table. And I basically pulled out what I had at the time in my pantry and my fridge to take this. So variety is not just the spice of life, but the health of our diet. And today we eat basically less than 12 foods over and over again. Back even just 100 years ago, we ate over 120, I think, foods. And the typical hunter-gatherer has 150 things at least that they regularly eat. And I don't know if this looks cool or scary to you, but it's some of the variety of mushrooms, and several of these actually do grow here. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to gather this one. It's a stinkhorn, and someone said, please come get it out of my yard. And I said, I'll gladly do that, because they're edible, believe it or not. And, more of the fascination, these are of mushrooms, these are called earth stars. And, they're a little too chewy to be edible, but they're not toxic. And they have a lot of sort of magical folklore, as you can imagine. This is another thing. You can see one of those earth stars in here. This is an artist who has taken all mushrooms except for the fish. So this looks as if you are underwater, when the fact is it's all fungus. And again, it's just to illustrate the what's amazing. These are real mushrooms in our area, very common and edible. So you don't have to eat these things to be fed by them. You see what I mean? Like, we don't just get nutrients in what goes in our mouths, but if you look up the sense of awe, that is one of the things psychologists say is like a very healthy sense, and that's what we get from nature. Some of you, at least Jen, will recognize who this is. My co-director's daughter with fiddleheads, some of which are edible, but all of which are delightful. And a beautiful bowl of wild wineberry, wild lamb's quarter, and a native honeysuckle, I guess, in the background. And of course, some people just want to know, can I eat it? That's my number 2 question after what is it? Can I eat it? And this, in fact, is a pasta made with those nettles before for the color. And those are young pine cones when they're still tiny and still actually edible whole. And a few other ingredients in there. I'd have to look at my notes to remember. But one of the restaurants making a food out of what was gathered is that right there. And then number 5, I think I said better for the earth. Well, it's sustainable. This is one 3-hour collection of over 100 pounds of chanterelles. If these had been clean and not like full of mud, which every single one was, it would have been, $1,500 at least, maybe $2,000. For those of you who only think in terms of, dollars and cents, that's my partner. I just finished off the last jar of that frozen a couple weeks ago from 2013. That's how many I put up from one outing. Yeah, this is, I often will get on not my soapbox, my stump. That's more appropriate. When people think, if everyone were to forage, we would destroy the woods. Well, the fact is, like, if everyone went out foraging with, sometimes I say a chainsaw, but maybe that's exaggeration. How about a machete? If every single person in the country went out with a machete to go foraging, we would do less damage than we're doing now with what you buy in the store. So let's say you eat broccoli or something. Broccoli isn't native here, and so we have to wipe out everything that's there in order to plant those things that we want, because we have European tastes. And therefore, this might offend some of you, but in the view of a hunter-gatherer, like, getting back to nature means getting back before agriculture. Because agriculture, the word literally means growing in a field. And to create a field on most of the planet, you have to basically bulldoze what's there. Even a natural meadow is not like an agricultural field. So in order to do that, anyone who's a gardener, a real gardener knows there's more killing involved in gardening than like nurturing. I mean, I'm constantly pulling weeds. And that's pretty painful for me, believe me. Because I do some gardening because my girlfriend loves it, and sometimes you have to compromise. But the worst thing humans have done to the earth is try to grow food. That's why I'm showing a desert, because this desert, or if you think of the Fertile Crescent, which is Iraq right now, is a desert thanks to agriculture, thanks to trying to grow food. It creates deserts. And if you want me to explain how, then ask, and I'll tell you. But this is the third myth of foraging. After it's too dangerous, we destroy the earth. The third is, well, there's not enough left. None of these four myths are true, in my view. Okay? And the reason for that is not just that, this is a pile of lobster mushrooms, by the way, that we gathered with these kids. When I talk about foraging, I'm not talking about people going out with machetes. That's not, and just getting what they can. The word forage in French means to pillage. Foraging, the way we see it, is not foraging the way a real hunter-gatherer practices it. If any of you have heard of permaculture, that is what hunter-gatherers practice. What that means is they go out and they harvest sustainably. So we know that word, but what we're doing now is inherently unsustainable. When you forage, you really forage the way a hunter-gatherer does it. You practice permaculture, which means you work with nature, not against nature. It doesn't mean you don't grow anything, but it means you look around and you see what already grows here easily. Let me encourage that. So that's a partnership. That's different than wiping everything out and putting in something from somewhere else and calling that, sustainable, even if it's organic. So if you do things that way, there is enough for everyone. Even 8 billion people, if we practice permaculture, there would be enough for everyone. 2 more reasons. I'm going to play, I guess it's a video here. You're looking at what's called mycelium. This is a network some of you may have thought of, and it's a little bit of an artist's rendition of mycelium being global, which is a bit of a stretch, but when you see a mushroom, you see the tip of an iceberg of what they call the woods wide web. Because it's true that in an area sometimes miles across, everything is connected underground. And it's connected through fungus, through threads that are 1/7 the thickness of a human hair. They're invisible, and yet 8 miles of it can be in a square inch of soil. I mean, can you imagine? How's that even possible? I can't imagine that. And yet, not only is it that extensive in a microscopic way, but in a macroscopic one. And so here you have an image of a forest. This is a schematic of all the trees connected in the woods, and the large ones are the oldest trees that are connected to all the youngest ones. And they actually believe now that trees teach each other, that the elders teach the youth, because there's this communication network. It is literally an internet going on. It's just not our language. So if you ever saw Avatar, that's the sort of point of it. And that's a real thing. This is a woman called Susan Simard, who you can look up, and she was one of the pioneers in discovering this. And what I mean by saying that our view is backwards is that we see ourselves as individuals when, I think it's the African phrase Ubuntu, it says, I am because we are. We are only individuals the way that your finger is an individual. Let's say your fingers are sticking out. Well, this might sound kind of creepy, but if your fingers were sticking out of the soil, you might think they were individual. Just like we look at mushrooms and we think they're individual. And yet you and I know that underneath, those fingers are connected to a hand that is connected to a body. And the same is true of humans. We walk around thinking we're separate, but that's meaningless when you look causally at why we're here today and how we exist. The only reason humans are around is because of how we are the most social animal. So there's a real lesson here that, mushrooms have to teach us. And I'm really skimming through this, so, you're free to stop me at any point or ask me to go back. But here are the 6 reasons I've gone through, and the last one, fun, is really the intersection of all of them. So people often say, I ask them, why do you do this? And why are you interested? And they're like, well, I thought it'd be fun. And when you really press them, it's one of these reasons. But people aren't conscious of it because we're so far from our true nature, from our true identity as hunter-gatherers now. And it's only been a few thousand years, and yet look at what's happened with the COVID. Like, people have gotten into gardening, right? Maybe because they just need something to do, maybe because they want to be self-sufficient. But if you want to truly have it easy and not have to depend on a garden, mine which is being eaten as I speak by rabbits and voles and feels pretty hopeless, why work against nature? Our challenge is really to get back to, who we really are, and getting back to nature. You ask a child where their food comes from, they're going to say the store, and you try to educate them. Well, no, it actually comes from a farm. Well, that's not true. It comes from nature, and the farm has merely, how should I put this, institutionalized it, enslaved it. So we all have a pretty positive view of farming generally, unless you take the red pill and you realize there's a reality behind, the domestication that we live under, in a lot of ways. And so I think this is my last slide in that series. And we've all heard of Thoreau, but his last book, which he died before publishing, was called Wild Fruits. And it was about foraging. And this is a quote from that unfinished book of his. So again, this was a guy who broke the mold, right, of his society. And so foraging was there for a lot, take a lot of outsiders again. I recently learned that Alfred Kinsey, who was one of the sort of pioneers of studying sexuality, he actually wrote, before he published his sexuality, a guide to wild foods that is still in print today. So he was into foraging. The famous composer, classical composer in the 50s, he actually was in Black Mountain. He was into foraging too. I'm just going to continue to run through these, and I'm going to trust that my administrators are watching the questions. But this gorgeous thing is a chicken of the woods, and it was growing right here in Nashville. I mean, literally in the city, and someone called me about it and wanted to know what it was and was curious, and I came and I took this photo and I said, do you want it? He said no, and I have to say it broke my heart, but within 5 minutes I sold it to a restaurant for $150. But I wish that I was able to simply put it on display, and let a lot of people enjoy the beauty of it, not just the flavor, which is indeed like chicken. Yeah.
What is a wild food that you think might be surprising to people? Either surprising that you can eat it, but I am surprised to learn that you can eat stinkhorns and that they would be palatable.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear what those actually taste like, and if there's any other examples over the years where people have thought you can eat that, and or maybe where the taste doesn't seem to quite match the view.
People ask me questions like this. Well, what is your favorite wild food? Name a surprising one. And there's so many that they almost draw a blank. Stinkhorns is one. Insects is usually one that gets people. And so I was on Lifetime recently, and I made the mistake of bringing insects, and the whole show we spent 3 hours on wild foods, and that's the one little bit they put 30 seconds in. So there's mushrooms. I can show you one that melts into black ink, and it was so disgusting looking to most people that P.B. Shelley, the English poet, wrote a long poem in 1820 called The Sensitive Plant. And the last 3 stanzas are about what happens when you don't weed your garden. And again, I'm saying, and you may remember the cartoon I showed you, that if you don't weed the weeds are stronger and they take over. Well, in his poem, everything takes over, including fungus. And the one fungus in particular that takes over is this awful thing that comes up, and its mass rotted off of it flake by flake, till the thick stalk stuck like a murderer's stake, and rags of loose flesh yet trembled on high, infecting the winds that wander by. Okay, so that's called shaggy mane. It's a type of inky cap. And it's called that because it melts into ink, and it's delicious. In fact, even most books will tell you eat it before it melts. But the surprising thing is that I let it melt, and I collect the ink. And if you've ever used squid ink, it's extremely similar, and you can use it the same way. So you can make like black and white checkered pasta, for example. I have some in the freezer I've actually been saving. I think I ought to go ahead and eat it because I haven't had any takers yet. And it's going to come around again this fall. I love that one as an example, you know. A lot of you know this little false strawberry that if you've ever actually tasted, people call it snakeberry, airberry. I used to call it disappointment berry. And there's other names for it, but some people are just surprised that it's edible at all, and some people disparage it because it doesn't taste like a strawberry. But now I call it Zenberry because the whole point of Zen, in fact, Suzuki Roshi said, to the student of Zen, a weed is a treasure. The point is to not have expectations. It's a wonderful wild food if you don't think it should be a strawberry. So foraging is a meditation. You know, it's a lesson in non-attachment. People used to say I look like Bob Dylan. And there's a lot of mushrooms like they called false this, like false chanterelle, or that first one I think I call it false morel. Well, I don't want to be called false Bob Dylan. And that's what happens when you define one thing in terms of another. So if people ask me, you know, name an unusual mushroom or name your favorite mushroom, you know, like foragers can't be choosers. So I've learned not to play favorites, and I can barely answer the question because I don't fixate on particular things, you know. One of the slides shows a list of those 150 common things, and we use that list on our tours and tell people don't try to memorize all these different names. We'll circle them at the end. And that list exists on our website, which is No Taste Like Home. And there are over 300 wild foods here, and that's not counting hundreds of mushrooms. You know, I only put maybe 20 on that list of 150 common ones. And I guess I've more than answered your question. So are there any others? I see someone posted one. How do you select and access potential foraging sites? You unfortunately have to be careful. Part of our disempowerment as a culture is that it's not legal to forage anywhere. Unlike in Europe, there's actually, I don't know the term, I think it might be in Norwegian, but it translates as every man's right. And it's actually a legal right going back hundreds of years to forage on anybody's property as long as you stay away from their house and don't damage anything. Anyone is free. You know, there's no like trespassing that can stop you. Wouldn't that be amazing? I would love that. But there's public lands, and those are not necessarily open to foraging, such as national parks, which surprisingly there is limited foraging allowed in the Smokies, for example. You can pick for mushrooms. I'm trying to remember. I might be getting this confused with the Parkway, but it's 1 pound per species per person per day. So you could get a pound of, say, blueberries or a pound of reishi mushrooms each day per person. So the regulation looks something like that. In national forest, you are free to harvest for personal consumption. I don't know if it's defined just how much is personal and how much isn't. The laws are very vague or non-existent, and you find out the hard way, as I did a few years ago. I was on the at the Arboretum gathering berries off the ground when I was threatened with arrest if I didn't drop the berries. My friend was with me, and she said, I was tempted to refuse because I thought this was going to be great publicity. And my friend whispered to me, Alan, I have a meeting at 2. I don't have time to get arrested today. So I let it go. But I have a photo of her just 2 minutes before that happened. And I'll see if I could pull that up and show it to you with the berries. All right, you can always ask permission on private land. I guess you could ask the trust folks. I don't know what the rules are there. Nowadays, we stick to private land for our tours. And I'm pretty careful on public land. But my understanding last I checked was that you could get a permit if you want to harvest commercially in National Forest, and I think it's $20 for 3 weeks. And it's like unlimited, but for certain things like ramps. So good luck if you want to look into that. But it's unfortunately not cut and dry. You know, state parks like DuPont, tend to be the strictest. Things like Chimney Rock Park, like that's, the most uptight, let's say, for foraging.
Folks here at Balsam are fortunate to have, quite a lot growing on their home sites. We've got really rich deciduous forest, and just walking the trails out on the preserve, we find mushrooms and edibles and things all the time. So for folks listening, that is something that the trust also can do, is to just come out to your home site and help you identify some of what is just growing in your yard. Looks like we have another question. Can you describe what a typical foraging outing is like? So if someone were to book a tour with No Taste Like Home, what would they expect?
Typically, we go out for 3 hours. That's our full, our sort of classic tour. And everyone gets a basket and a knife, and eventually, after showing people a few things and then setting you loose, we lay it all out on a sheet and organize it into piles and distinguish, and point out what's edible from what isn't, and then we cook up some at the end. Here's another sheet with the piles already made of the things we've gathered, and I think I have yet another one from a different time of year, and it is different every time. There's some roots, so I'm looking at nuts, so I'm guessing this is, I was going to guess fall, but actually these look like ramps, so it might be earlier spring, and those nuts were probably just added by the guide, now that I think about it. After that, we cook some up, and you can take home some, or you can bring it to a restaurant. Inside of those 3 hours, you might learn more in depth about just a handful of these, maybe 5 or 10 at most do we really focus on, because there's only so much you can learn in a day. Mushrooms for most of us are like a foreign language, and the best way to learn it, right, is to go to that country and to spend time there. And it's the really only way to learn this, because it's not knowledge so much as a skill, and you learn a skill by practice. So you don't learn a whole language in a day, right? You need to do it over and over again. So we actually have a season pass, we offer for people so that they can join us. And we've had people, come on many, many tours, because again, you need 2 things, practice and guidance. And I'm not trying to sell just us. I mean, you can join a mushroom club here, and for like $20 a year, you can get those things. I mean, in any other country in the world, you learn from your parents or your grandparents, or at least someone down the street, and it would be free. But you would learn gradually. You wouldn't even have to think about it. And one of the typical questions is something like, well, how in the world can you tell an edible thing from a poisonous one? And I turn it around and I say, well, how can you tell cabbage from iceberg lettuce? Everyone can tell, right? But did you go to school for that? Did you ever think about that? You learn wild foods the same way. They're no more difficult to tell apart. It's just, what have you grown up with? Our tours, we sort of pack things in because people expect that, and that's the way we learn in school, and you pay for that. But the fact is, you're not going to really learn this or any skill without practice and some guidance from someone. There's one word I want you to walk away with that is the most important word if you want to get started foraging. It's not where do you go, it's not, how do you remember this or that or distinguish it. This is the answer to that, to both those questions. It has 3 letters. And I'm going to have you guess either with your chat thing or calling it out on speaker, but it's what you do when you want to learn about foraging, or you think you have something that's edible and you're not sure what it is. What do you do? I'll give you a hint. It's a verb. It's not run, eat, try, die. What else have I gotten? Any guesses? C. Yeah, that's a good guess, because people would think, okay, you need to look more carefully. And I think that's misleading, because in some ways we rely on our sight way too much. In fact, I have people smelling and tasting things on tours all the time. That's what a dog does. We offer them food, right? Or an animal. Our little database in our heads, that's an instinct that we have, has a lot less to do with sight than with those other senses. Because it goes back eons, into our past. And I see we've got another question in the queue, the best time to go foraging. I'm going to give you a hint. What that person just did is what the answer to that puzzle is. It's not C.
Ask?
Yes, that's the word. That's the answer. Congratulations. You will live to see another day.
You got it too.
Yeah, the word is ask. And what is the point that in Africa, in Tonga language, there's an expression that says, the one who asks is the one who does not die from eating poison mushrooms. That's actually a very common expression. And again, that's my point. Learn from someone else. So what's this person doing on the chat? They're asking me a question, which was, let's see if I can get back to it. I forgot it already. This is the other reason I became a forager and not a farmer. I have ADHD, so I can't stay focused on one thing.
The best time of year to go foraging.
Yeah, right, exactly. You know how I dodged the question about what's, name an interesting thing or what's the best mushroom? There's no best time either. Let me be forgiving and give you the short answer. We run basically with our main season with daylight savings time. So mid-March through, what is that, first week of November or something. That's the warm season. That's when most things are growing. That's a pretty broad answer, right? What is that? It's maybe 6 months or something. There's different things at every time of year. And if you want mushrooms, the peak mushroom season is July through September. Okay? But those morels you saw, those are in April. And if you want hen of the woods, that tends to be in October. So there's always exceptions. If you want the most variety of plants, then you want April, more or less. Okay, that's just sort of an explosion of things that come out then. It's not the most quantity necessarily, but it's the most variety. If you want the most quantity of plants to harvest, that's the harvest season that everyone knows is sort of September, right? In the autumn, when everything's matured. And it's the same for wild foods. But, best can mean a lot of things. And that's the short answer. The real answer is as often as you can, because even in the winter, there are things that you'll find at no other time during the year. And you're not just going to get stuff. So I don't know what you mean by best, but I tell people don't ever go foraging, or more specifically, don't ever go mushroom hunting, because in that case, you're treating the woods like a supermarket and you're just trying to get stuff. Let the food come in the process of enjoying a walk in the woods and enjoying nature. I mean, this is what in the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the lilies of the field is that don't worry about whether you're gonna eat. Okay, the food is gonna come, and this is one of the real things that foraging feeds you with, is the knowledge of like you don't have to worry about when to go. Am I gonna have enough food? Like, my problem is too much food. Right now I have a basket of mugwort root like rotting on the porch because like I don't know who to give it to. I have mugwort coming out of my ears.
All right, well, thank you. You've certainly given us a good sense of some of the reasons behind foraging, and well beyond just gathering food. And certainly that is something that we try to incorporate into our programming, is the many ways that nature teaches and heals us and connects us to each other. And I think you made all of those connections with foraging as well. Alan, unless you have any final thoughts about foraging that you want people to take home.
Again, like foraging is, for me, most about reconnection. And if it's fun, I think that's the joy of it, that this is a Garden of Eden that really exists. And so these days when we live with a lot of fear, if not a lot of hate, like all those things are what happens when we leave nature. Not just nature out there, but nature is our bodies, and our human nature is our hearts. And hunter-gatherers have all those things wrapped together. They live with abundance. They live with, everyone being equal. They live without fear. And hopefully that is what you all will discover if you don't have it already, if you get into foraging. And I hope to see you on our walk when we have it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Everyone else, have a great night, and stay tuned for more from the Trust.